innovations developed from our regional perspectives. And the third one is to add human, technological, and all kinds of resources that will strengthen this perspective. Today, we're having our third session, and I want to let you know that in the previous sessions, all the previous sessions are available in the Charisma Foundation website. And if you want to be up to date in order to get more information on our activities, you can access our website, which is otracienciaabierta.carisma.org.co. Today's topic is climate change and citizen participation beyond data donors. And we have two guests. The first one is going to be Allan, a Brazilian man that, as me, is practicing his wild Portuñol to communicate with his friends from Latin America. Allan is going to give us a presentation on citizen science connecting networks for common knowledge. He has plenty of experience in the coastal region of Brazil in regards of citizen awareness, and he has great interactions, very interesting interactions, in order for us to better think how citizen participation takes place in those initiatives. Allan is a visitor professor in the postgraduate program in the Paraíba National University, and he participates in the University of Lagos, CindaLab, which is a team of investigation in Brazil, and also the collaboration network for ecological economy and common goods and climate justice with the University of York. We want to thank his participation and his team. So Allan, you can take over, and after that, I will introduce Francisco for our second intervention today. Thank you very much, Anne. And I am going to be here, go wild with my Portuñol. Let me know whether my presentation is already visible. It's a pleasure to be with all of you in this talk in order to share knowledge on the work that we are doing regarding climate change and citizen participation, citizen engagement. I want to tell you about two different projects that we are moving forward. One of them is in Brazil, specifically, which has to do with this logo right here on the lower right-hand side in order to build a Brazilian network of climate change activities. And the second part of the work that we are doing in Los Lagos University, we're working with Francisco Caraus, who is the second guest to this panel. About these two experiences, I want to begin by letting you know about a call that where we are working all from the context of open science and citizen science. And this shape represents an idea that we don't only want to have with open access and open research and open data, but also we want to get people involved in order to promote this kind of dialogue and topics and shared knowledge in order to share knowledge between different actors, among different actors. The general concept that is well known by many is an encounter from people that are interested in different topics and researchers of specific topics as well, in order to do the reach out of information and the co-production of knowledge. Today, there are a couple of citizen science initiatives at global level, well, at the level of Australia, Europe, the United States. And here we have the IPCAP, which is the Ibero-American Participative Science, and we also have the Brazilian one, where there is a parallel collaboration and support to all these initiatives. There is the platform that is called CIBIS, where we have different collaborators for this production of citizen science. And this topic is related to climate change. And I want to highlight the work of the Monitoring Center and the Early Warning for Disasters in Brazil. This is an education program that seeks to involve schools and the learning for this production on climate change in order to prevent disasters or to do early warnings in connection to these disasters. At the level of Brazil, there is the observation and monitoring system of the indigenous Amazon to do this observation alongside with the indigenous communities in that part of the world. More specifically and more recently, I think at the beginnings of this year and the end of the end of last year, there is work that uses this particular application that is called data and tests of water. The idea is to get people involved so that they can build their own data collection. What we find that is significant is the amount of rain. This is very interesting. This kind of work is very interesting that we are sharing from Brazil. And since 2015, since 2014 and 15, we have participated in a project called Open Science Ubatuba. Ubatuba Open Science, led from Sao Paulo, Brazil, to promote open practices and collaborative practices for ancestral knowledge alongside the investigation and the research. And that's where we started working with the group that Anna just presented, and alongside Arida Dagle that continued this project, we began working with this project called CODAP. We're talking about climate change, and we are working day after day with all these organizations in order to indicate these indexes of coastal risks for different communities in the whole coastal zones, but also the inner parts of the countries. And we're talking about a scenario that is ever more frequent and also where greater magnitudes are present. And this kind of threat has to do with extreme climate, such as extreme heat, cyclones, but also other events that we call rise in temperature or rise in sea levels. This kind of scenario is what we are studying and that we see increasing in frequency, and this impacts the lives of people. The thing that we see from both initiatives is how these impacts affect traditional communities, ancestral traditional communities. We are still in need of more local information data. The measurements of the rise in sea levels and temperature, we need more regional data, more specific data at the regional information at the local scale. in order for us to have information that will help decision making. And there is an ever increasing, ever greater need to communicate this information to the society and to the scientific community. This is a way by this is a means by which people will be making a contribution to science. We are working in this particular place, Brazil, and the south of Chile. These two places, here we have three communities, three cities, Guarampia, Guarabatuva, and the south of Chile, in order to build and to do training with coastal communities, but mostly traditional communities. So we are working with Mapuches in Chiloé, Kenyan, more specifically, the traditional fishermen in these places. In Brazil, also, we're working with traditional fishermen and Afro descendants, Afro Brazilians who use their knowledge applied to their own culture. So we use an approach with them in order to map the societies and their observations in order to integrate the data that are produced by the official institutions, both in Brazil as in Chile. Part of this work is connected to the endeavors in schools. Pluviometers, for example, low-cost pluviometers, such well made with plastic bottles in order to make handmade pluviometers and to distribute these in a map so this school community can work with their own communities and their surrounding areas. If I see 100 millimeters in 24 hours, what does that actually mean? Because why is it, why are these the data in one place and in another different? What are the levels of risks that happen in different places? So we need to create this awareness as well. Part of this work with schools, we need to work on training at the regional level, geographical level, show them how we can do that overlap, the times of risks at in people's houses, and evacuation routes, for example, are very important. Part of this work is to collaborate the Risk Reduction Disasters Network in Sao Paulo. By doing this part, which is citizen science, and how to use that mapping and how to build learning communities and how schools and the communities can use this information. This was the work, this is the work that we have done so far, and this has been done with the support of the British Council and these universities, both from England and Brazil. We started this work that started with a workshop which is called Traditional Communities Empowerment in the in Brazilian coastal zones to face climate crisis. We use this approach and expanded to work with it in the whole coastal zones of Brazil. The idea was alike to what we did before, working with students, traditional communities, and the usage of reference technologies and digital technologies, bearing in mind planning what we are going to do with this data and to create the training, create an application, but all this information coming from a local society and analyzed together the results of the data. So we have prepared this mapping kit for individuals in the local communities in order to collect data, GPS collecting, questions and interviews to people on climate change, precisely in order to do this gathering of information. And we use this platform, which is called this history map, story map, a format, and we link all that together in a platform that I will describe further ahead. It's a platform at the global level that we collect in Chile, for example. We analyzed 7 places in Brazil, which are Pará, Recife, Alagoas, Rio de Janeiro, Bahia, São Paulo, and Santa Catarina. Well, those are 6 different regions at least, in order to work with different local communities in our approach. This data collection methodology. What we found is researchers who are individuals that come from universities alongside a local community, working together with these researchers that are here on the right-hand side. Everything bearing in mind the idea that we need to build a network that studies the impacts and adaptation to climate change. One important part of this short-term plan, in 4 months of application, we distributed observations in 137 local observations. Open interviews in order to contextualize what was being observed in the field, on the ground. And the result was also linked to a platform that is called Local Indicators of Climate Change Impacts. This is coordinated by the Autonomous University of Barcelona, where we began a collaboration with them. The first important thing was to create this platform and adapt it to the Portuguese language. That's where we started migrating part of this methodology to the platform. At the moment, we are producing this script or screenplay with the communities, with the local communities. Part of this work has to do with the cycle of dialogues with the Lychee project in order to show what can be done at the local level that can be shared at global level. Migrating, but not actually migrating, but actually creating new linkage with this observation network of local indicators connected to climate change. As part of this co-op data, we are doing an open migration in order to share, but also do the reach out of how this information can be used both at local and global level. This is a quick presentation, and my conclusion here is like the idea to create this participation with the people. We are working from the perspective of citizen science. We already know a lot about this. Jennifer Sherp, for example, is another person, and the general idea is to get out of this contribution level to a level of co-creation, which is building questions together, questions that make sense to the community, to the academic community. In order to create this, there needs to be spaces for dialogue. This is what these training courses and community work is being studied with this kind of work, in order to get out of the mass production, not only dying there, not only staying there, but moving forward in, in a way to make everything more collaborative. In order for the, as a means of for the creation, for the discussion here, how can science, citizen science, use for a common knowledge with local communities and traditional communities included? This diagram is an idea from Marianne that includes these several participation groups to create these knowledge spaces, distinct and different knowledges that can be built in order to create a syntax in order to work more in a more collaborative way. N- Near the wrap up, we want to work with autonomy, protagonism, creativity, collaboration, but we also want to find a power, because when we're talking about participation, we need to ask these questions: who participates and how do they participate? So we need to go beyond everything that's being done, beyond data collection, and also get people involved as protagonists of these processes, the knowledge production process, and promote this kind of dialogue. Today, we're working with this idea, connecting and collaborating with these knowledge communities and learning communities. There's our communities that have already worked in solidarity, sharing experiences and common knowledge. Well, this is our collaboration network. Is a lot bigger than it looks here, but this is just to give you an idea of what an amazing encounter this is. Amateur scientists and expert scientists who want to share all this knowledge. Well, thank you very much, and look forward to your comments. Thank you very much, Allan. Well, I encourage all our guests to include their questions in the chat. The idea is for us to have a shorter presentation in order for us to devote more time to your questions and have a freer dialogue. So now, well, at least I do have 2 or 3 questions for Allan, and we are going to go into the second part right now, where we are going to be with Francisco Arauz, who is going to give us a presentation called Community Centrist Investigation and Action for Transformation. Francisco is Associate Professor of the University of Los Lagos, Chile, investigator from the Center on Regional Development of the Republics, sede ULagos, and he's the director of the Citizen Science Laboratory of the same House of Studies. Thank you very much, Francisco. Hello, Annie. Thanks for this invitation. Thank you, Alan. Hello, everyone who is joining us from different platforms. I will go through my presentation. I will share my screen, but I also wanted to take this opportunity to mention, well, Annie, I want to expand on what you said, that this kind of science, this open science or citizen science, has a long history in Latin America. In my classes, I try to place ourselves and give the importance of earlier Orlando Falls Borda participative science. There are 2 very important um, intellectual backgrounds that are a testimony to that trajectory that today has different names, but they come from that very source, that very spring. I understand. I think you are already being, you can now see my screen. My presentation, as Annie mentioned it, and Annie said the title, I'm going to talk about a specific experience of a work developed in indigenous communities of southern Chile, Patagonian Chile, Huyage, Guanichi, these communities, and how this has expanded to other experiences with other social groups. The genesis of this project is relevant because many of our projects of investigation and action, they begin with a problem, either a research question, but in this case, the people who live in the territories where we work might have and might come up with issues. And in our case, is related to the serious environmental pollution in the coast. This is produced by a huge industry that has started an enclave there over the 40 years producing is the salmon industrial production and export. Every time there are different problems with contamination in the archipelago of the Patagonia. In that journal, in that newspaper, there is a report of a huge phenomenon. There was great salmon mortality. There were tons and tons, and they were thrown to the sea. And stemming from that process, there were a series of environmental issues that affected the natural resources, and afterwards, they created a huge social crisis. There were protests for over 2 months, especially in the largest island of this archipelago, and this indicates what the responses of the local groups are and how they respond to these issues. On that basis and in that context, as a research group, as a laboratory, we research, but we also collaborate with the implementation of a law that actually grants rights, territorial rights for the area, for the marine and coastal area, where there are protected areas administrated, managed by indigenous communities. There were a series of demands from the communities to the scientific community in order to support these projects. What we did was to apply a participatory monitoring processes for the conditions, social and environmental conditions of the country between 2019 and 2020 in one of these marine indigenous areas, or from the uh, training of new citizens that we call environment, and finally to make a contribution to the care and the heritage by means of this citizen monitoring and an alert system where there will be alerts when there are problems that affect these communities. Gathering experiences from different initiatives, sister initiatives, I would call them, the participation with marine fauna, the fauna, we realized that there was a need to build a methodology that would be as simple as possible, but that would also allow different groups with different kinds of knowledge the capability of developing participatory monitoring and the inclusion of different protocols. So what we proposed was a methodology divide, a fourfold methodology with the community decides on their objectives and the interests, and the the community centers are decided. The community also have its own indicators and it steps that when the registries are created and sent to the laboratories, and finally the reach out, which is when the data is ready for the people to get access to. If you join here, you will be able to see it in www.centinelascomunitarios.co. That's where we propose a series of dimensions of our territories and marine territories. We are not only interested in environmental things, but also in social things. The territories are spaces for life where social interaction is ever present. The idea is to include all different items. Environmental threats can also be monitored, different practices of certain kinds of natural resources, communitary practices of collection, harvesting, and so on, ritual practices, community practices associated to the leisure time and community life, and histories of social memory, vital histories of human groups in the territories. They all have their own description of what we allude to with different things. This is just a graph that shows an highly complex territory, rich both in fauna, biodiversity, and social diversity. There is also the presence of industrial processes, and it is in this context that we are working. More specifically, our first case done in a community called Karelmapu, which means Greenland in the Pambuche language. And we did it. Kempo is the ECMPO. This is the organization for marine areas. This was done in May 2021, done by community, uh, indigenous community members, gathering 150 people around. We worked with 5 specific individuals. There were 35 reports on these dimensions: biodiversity, environmental threats, and cultural landscape. This is an example of a video. This was sent by a traditional fisherman from one of the communities. In his work, he sent this. I forgot to tell you that the monitoring means are cell phones. We create WhatsApp groups or Messenger groups. In order to create groups, we create a chat, whereas members of the laboratory, we participate and people get training in order to send a series of data on what they want to sell. Well, we ask them is a description that can be either written or recorded, audio recorded, a picture that shows what they are observing, and the ear place, their location. We organize all this information and we send it to the platform that I will show you later. They send us this kind of thing. I don't know whether you were able to hear at the background. What we heard is the sound, is the noise of the engine of the ship. He sent the media, but what he describes or what he tells us is the absence of seals that are very common in the Chilean coast. And his observation is a place that is in that particular area that is called Doña Sebastiana Island. They said this place is known as the Stone of the Wolf. 3 years ago, it was full of seals. Right now, we don't see any of it. They say that the fishing boats hunted these seals in order to make baits for fishing. So this is very interesting. It's interesting to see how the dimensions of biodiversity, there is a historic memory associated with this particular individual's work. And I'm talking about this particular transformation process that nature is going through in this particular place. Well, this particular species, the seals, are the kind of pressure that they might be undergoing. This is another case, and we do it in another context. This is a Cordillera Lagoon, the mountain range lagoon, where there are different indigenous communities, and we did a century process up there. These images, these illustrations, are images from Sebastian Paulo. This is a collaborator, as a contributor that helps us finding a common language. This was reviewed between September 2021 and 2022, February 2022, with the community. There were about 20 reports and the threats, environmental threats, and the advocates for the lagoon group was created. These are two registries sent by Victor Cuchipe, who you can see on his boat. The picture on the left shows a log, seemingly without a lot of story, but when he tells us what it means, he tells us what navigation was in this lagoon 30 or 40 years ago, where this area was a lot more populated. Now there are large monoculture, pine monoculture for the logging industry. It tells us the boat navigation was common here. The people of the community travel from one place that is called Rincon to another that is called Trinidad in order to get transport to go to the capital or to go to other places of logging works. In the picture, we see that an old boat. That piece was actually the piece of log used to be part of the deck. This tells us about how the landscape has been transforming in this area. Closing to the wrap up, with this registry, we create the binnacles, the monitoring binnacles, and we take this information to a platform. Those binnacles can be found. There is the methodology. If you go to mapping, you will find a map as this one, where we will improve the visualization. Geospace visualization of the registers that are being done so that all the processes can be monitored on these territories where we work. We also have been developing, in the framework of our colleague Jaime Husak, a digital tool in order to do vigilance, which we try to all create biodiversity registries, but also denounce environmental threats in different areas. There are 3 wetland spaces that are being monitored here. To wrap up, we want to tell you that what we have learned here, there are different lessons that we have learned here, and the citizens are protagonists, and we need to support that protagonism in the care of the territories. And care needs to be understood as strategies and ample practices in conservation and protection beyond the official ones. After that, technologies needs to be appropriate and pertinent, so that social processes and everything is included. After that, the possibility that this kind of information could actually influence policy making at the regional or territorial level. How society can legitimate information that is gathered in a participatory way. There is a dialogue on integration of knowledge. The language is very important. And finally, this idea that knowledge is a common good, and therefore, on the basis of establishing that this knowledge that is commonly generated is very important, how to establish protocols and local agreements for the common use of this data. And I think that's the end. Thank you very much. The links are there available to you, and we will move forward. Thank you. Thank you very much, Francisco. You ended kind of early. You even have a few minutes. I have a question in the chat, and I encourage all our attendees to include their questions. We are all friends, and you can also write. So I'll begin with the first one. The first question that is for Allan, while the others include their questions. The first one is from Indira Angela Luisa Isagure, and she tells us, "Excellent, Allan. I wanted to know uh, how I can replicate that pluviometer, and if there is a social traditional technology for the temperature and level of the sea." Thank you very much for the question. Thank you, Indira Izaguirre. She's a colleague who worked with us in this work in the traditional communities in Brazil. She's in Pará, Braganza. Indira, I've just shared in the chat a link to an education program which is called The Education. I, I went through it a little quickly, but the idea is that there is a set of participatory activities from the construction of this, for example, this handcraft pluviometer, but also the knowledge of how the rivers actually work and how the replication of this idea can be done. What we did in Brazil, and in this map, alongside with the teachers, we support and we replicate these ideas, this methodology, to show in the map where these sorts of activities are being done. The construction of handcraft pluviometers can be done, and the APP, the app, the application in the telephone. The individual can be doing his or her own monitoring of the community and can upload data on real time from what is being observed in the rain. We're working with the same ideas of building local groups so that this self-monitoring can be done and replicate these activities. That's it. But to the next question, no, I do not know. I don't have information on that. Where is the question? Temperature and sea levels. Temperature and sea levels. There is a project that I have been discussing with Francisco Arauz in Dos Lagos, is to bring a technology which is called the Sentry Tortoise. More than temperature, it also does the measurements of microplastics. This is a multi-sensor idea where there will be multi-monitoring functionality, and also the building of rulers, measurement devices to measure the levels of rivers, but not the sea. We don't know about the sea. Well, a bit of that technology, so I will share that on the chat. Francisco, do you have suggestions here? No, I think Alan mentioned everything. Okay, great. I do have a question because both of you spoke about data as an instrument for some sort of influence on policy and politics. But then Alan said data for decision making, and Francisco said that there were demands from the community to support the the construction of a law. From your own experience, how does this happen? Are the after all the monitoring and some data systematization, in what kinds of forums happen? Who are the people that join there? And what kind of reception does this data get? Francisco also tells us that one of the roles of the university would be to help validate this data. So I would like to know how it actually happens in reality. Shall I begin? Yes. It happens in different ways. I wouldn't say that there is no pre-established channel. It depends on what the local policy, the local dynamics are, where monitoring happens. There are some that are more informal ones. What we had is among the monitoring exercises, the first one was it looked like an archaeological site. And from that registry, and with our own contacts with archaeologists and the public institutions in charge of this area, we were able to bring this discovery or these registries closer to people in the institutions who would support these projects. From that very phenomenon, the need for some training came to be. So we created a webinar dedicated for the local school. So I think that was sort of informal. There was no pre-established channel, but it worked. And I would say that that is one path. The second one is the one that we are presently working on, is the possibility of establishing an alert system of a protected area. In the Maullín River, for example, what we want is to use methodology to go with curatorship and the participation of investigators in order to create an early alert system that allows them for the monitoring of certain areas from a communitarian citizen monitor system. And we want to give it to the actual managers and to deliver the whole method from the community that created and generated the information, protocols for verification, data verification, and after that, the communication channels. It would be an outreach channel or an environmental denounce, for example, and that would be it. Alan? What I would like to add is that the truth is that the institutions that produce risk vulnerability data, environmental and climate observation, they also have the idea that local information, whatever way they are produced, they need to be validated. So if we are going to use that as a basis for decision making, so they need to be validated. So what I'm saying is that there are plenty of opportunities that we have to work with the local observations. This challenge is deeper on how to demystify the data collection that could be work with validation that is community-based validation. This is an idea of getting together and to give an opportunity to the regular citizen, to the layman, to collect, share information, and share from this, learn from these processes. We need more time to produce this kind of community, to learning at the level of, at the community level. I would also like to mention this project of education in Brazil. What we want to do is that communities and local communities should produce ever more local data. When regular people would say, I can also make a contribution, what do I do? How do I do that? How can I make a contribution? That is, I would like to go on with this conversation for a long time because indeed I had another question that had to do with data governance. I did not have time to talk about that, but data that co-op data produce alongside the community, they give an idea of the Kern principles so that the data are easy to find, but with the principles of who produces this data. And it is actually the people who are the owners of those data. In order for that, protocols need to be built. The protocols that Francisco mentioned, there is a series of publications already in place and published on data software rights, what we were mentioning. Because, of course, there is a conflict between what I am producing locally and what sometimes people can produce for specific interests. But that's the point. There is a challenge, but there are ways to move forward. Well, you say care as in care, that data care, data fair, data fair, data care. Is that it? Yes, good. That I think is very interesting. Community data validation, I think is greatly interesting. In your work, we see that roles are exchanged sometimes. When Allan tells us that he has a mapping, a, a community mapping kit, it sounds like a researcher kit because they are actually sharing methodologies and doing research. And when we have community information, these people become innovators, which are two different roles that generally communities, well, the first one, yes, simple data donation, yes, but the second one, there are plenty of projects where there are that include community community councils, community committees. The care has to do with the data that the information should not harm the communities themselves. So that's a very important dimension, the data care. And I had one last question. If the people on the chat, documenting system mentioned by Francisco is very interesting. This WhatsApp, the most accessible tool, the simplest tool, as a photo, as a description, and the location of the particular fact, event, or episode. And after that, there is a lot of work to turn that into a log block in order to build social memory. I think that is greatly interesting because, in general, biodiversity monitoring platforms, the huge ones, really are very objective, and they lose they miss that kind of information. They discard, they do away with that. So that I think There is a lot of work. I would like you to tell more about that data transformation from one platform to the another, because I imagine that all of you are also in the publishing parish. That adds even more work. And I see that their in researchers are also mediators in the research processes. So I would like to hear a little bit about that documents, qualitative and quantitative documentation. That is one of the biggest work. It has to do with keeping that process alive. I would say that the whole initiative doesn't have publishing as its ultimate objective. That's not the first one. The first one is to create interaction spaces with what is being investigated, and maybe we might publish on some other things. Created that research space, and what we have seen is that for the groups that we work with, there is a strong result on the people when we take a look at the same places with a different view. We also got to the idea of WhatsApp mainly from the contact with different experiences. What they use the most is WhatsApp. Well, let's use it as well. Let's use it. This is a learning community. And of course, from when we get registries, we need to be in the process where we are also part of the chats. And in those chats, we participate and we are the moderators and we encourage people to participate. We try to deepen into that information that we get. Sometimes we ask, where is the place? Send us its location or the coordinates, geographical coordinates. And sometimes we have had information about an ancient gold production in a certain beach of a younger person who said that his grandfather used to do it. So you ask them whether his grandfather was still alive, and whether he was alive, we could he could be interviewed. And he sent us this interview with his grandfather, and this is all WhatsApp collected. After that, the systems process that is done in the lab, where we have matrix for these three information categories. And with that, we go through the logbook design and also a dialogue with the different groups that we work with in order to determine what is it that we're going to come up with. This was the first poster that we show some of the information we collect. The logbooks have the same format. After that, there's the third stage, which is the website, where georeference data are uploaded. And then that's where we talk with geographers, with anthropologists, geographers, geologists, engineers as well. And of course, the IT engineers. So there are huge, big teams, and this is a lengthy process. It has taken us up to a year. But because we have that pressure of publishing, we also try that the funds are not classical research funds, but they should be more flexible research funds, that they should have different times that have nothing to do with the more classical science. Thank you very much, Francisco. The issue of time and the pressure, if there is a different kind of background and different freedom degrees, there is this time for qualitative dialogue in order to create trust links. We've been there in Ubatuba, no doubt. We've seen those processes. I have one last question in order to use our time more wisely. For Francisco, a question on the century. On the citizen century, are the costs very high? Vigilad. Are these maintenance costs very high?
Los obstáculos es, yo diría que
The
motivación
main
siempre es difícil, digamos, y hay que estar ahí como
setback
siendo parte del proceso. Uno no puede como entrar y dejar, digamos, que las cosas sucedan sin uno estar presente.
is that you
Probablemente
have
eso
always
sea
to be on top of
el
things.
grado como de
Time is
cercanía
essential.
con las personas. Eso también
So
es un
monitoring,
obstáculo,
permanent
pero
monitoring is necessary.
pone a prueba
This is not
tu,
necessarily an
tu
obstacle, but
nivel
it
de
also
empatía, tu
tests
nivel como de
your
conexión
levels of
social.
empathy and social
Y diría que
relations.
eso es lo más
I would
complejo,
say that that
porque
is one
bueno,
of the
siempre
most
la idea es
complex
que lo haga
things.
en la medida en
Because the
que
idea is
desarrolle
that
su vida
people
cotidiana,
should
digamos,
be
y le
doing
guste hacer lo que
this
hace. Y
alongside
para en
their
general, entonces lo toman como un
daily
paseo de
lives.
fin de semana que no han hecho y que no iban a hacer
If
nunca.
an observation to a
Entonces
wetland is
seguir
going to be done,
jugando,
they take it as an outing and they're going to do a picnic or
entonces
something like
podría
that.
decir que
So
pueden ser
that is
obstáculos. Los
complex.
costos sí
That
son un
is,
poquito altos,
and
pero
the
yo creo que un
costs,
poco más
yes,
difícil
there are
tiene como
high
un
costs,
cierto financiamiento
but I would say
de las
that as
obligaciones,
long as
digamos.
one has a
Eh,
certain amount
no sé
of
cuánto será en dólares, pero dicho en
fine
pesos, hay una iniciativa que tiene que ver
funding,
con un fondo
research
de
funding.
postdoc,
Vigilife, we did
de
that with
beneficios
a
postdoc,
fund
y
of
que
one of our colleagues that
para
has a
eso armó el aplicativo y las
postdocs.
mantenciones la está desarrollando ahora.
And the
Pero son pruebas y
maintenance he's doing it, I wouldn't say that those are
en,
extremely high
en términos
costs
de la herramienta, digamos.
in terms of the tools
Pero sí son
themselves.
difíciles. Ahora,
Technological
mantener
tools
los
aren't
equipos
that
es lo
expensive.
más complejo, el
Now,
equipo humano. Y ahí es donde
keeping
nosotros
the
estamos
teams up,
constantemente
alive, the human
en
teams,
eso,
that's what's hard. That's where we need to find
y sostener otro y hacer otro
funds,
ciclo. Yo diría que ese es como lo
funding.
más difícil,
That's
la mantención
that's the hardest part, the maintenance of human teams. Okay, I imagine that Alan agrees. One of the most the really costly thing is the human teams. I want to add that the important thing is time. The time that conflicts with our academic things is also funding. You and Francisco also mentioned. So this challenge to keep the teams, the human teams together is extremely necessary. This is vital in order for us to be able to produce real results. Those of us who are working with this topic of open science, producing an application is easy. From IT, that is easy, it can be done. The problem is actually to get people involved so that what they are doing makes sense. Well, there needs to be a lot of communication, training, and so on. And there is a need for financial resources. Well, let's hope that this topic of climate change, well, is not going to leave us anytime soon. Let's hope that the funding will accompany us. We don't have any other questions right now. So if you have the last word, maybe the floor is yours. Otherwise, we will stop right here. I want to thank you very much for joining us and tell our attendees that our next session is going to be on the digital humanities, November 24th, the same time. Do you have a last thing to share with us? In fact, I want to thank once more this opportunity to have this conversation with yourselves. Once again, we're meeting and we will continue working. Thank you very much. Thanks for this opportunity to share our
Sí,
work with you.
igual muchas gracias también a Anne y bueno, Anne
Thank you very much,
y todo el
Anne,
equipo que
and
está
the whole
organizando
team that is organizing
los webinarios.
the
Y bueno, yo
webinars.
diría que el mensaje final es más bien
And we said the final message
de
is just
hacerlo
daring.
hay diversas plataformas
Daring.
y gratis
There's a number of
está por
free
disponible, si uno quiere
platforms.
usarlo, igual es posible usarlo,
Yes.
digamos, y es gratis, bueno,
There
gratis
are different things that
y se puede
are
utilizar
free today
y
that
de
can
verdad
be
yo diría
used.
que es como atreverse
And I would say that we need to dare look for these different ways to do science.
Yo diría que ese es como el mensaje, pasar a la acción.
That would be the message, to jump
Y bueno,
to
eso, muchas gracias
action.
a todos y espero
Thank you
en
very
los
much.
contactos están los links ahí quien quiere seguir
The
conversando.
contacts, links, emails, all contact is in there for those of us who want to have communication with us. Thank you. Thank you very much. It is fabulous to be with you. And the motivation of our series is to teach what can be done, that there is a way, there is a road, and that learning with other people is possible. And this is nothing that is actually impossible to understand. On the contrary, we developed great passion to learn. Thank you very much and see you next time.